very
Thank
good.
you.
All right, Mary, if you're ready, we are ready to go.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the book club at the Center, Birchfield Penny Art Center's monthly book club meeting. I cannot tell you how excited I am to welcome tonight's author, Buffalo-born Molly Peacock, and her exquisite novel, The Paper Garden. Mrs. Delany begins her life's work at 72. As I said last month, I was hoping to do this book while I was still 72, but I'm days short, and now I'm 73. But anyway, here we go. So I know you can see me, so I'm holding up the beautiful book. I hope if you have an opportunity, if you don't already, to purchase it because it is worth it. It is such an exquisite book. It's a little bit of an object of art itself. For those joining us for the first time, my name is Mary Kozeb, and I'm the Education Program Manager at the Birchfield Penny Art Center. One of the best parts of my job is this book club, which began over 13 years ago as a docent initiative. We started by reading books read and admired by Charles Ephraim Birchfield in order to deepen our relationship with him and understand the man and the artist that he was. We then began reading books that complemented the exhibitions. That's when I first heard about the Paper Garden. It was when we had the beautiful botanical show that was done along with the Buffalo Science Museum. Soon after that, we began reading authors, and there are many, many of them from our own region, a practice that supports the center's mission to celebrate the many talents and achievements within our own Western New York community, even those Western New Yorkers who now live in Canada, like Molly, and across the whole country. Since that time, we've welcomed over 60 authors as we welcome Molly this evening. But first, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Michaela Woros, who will explain the mechanics of the evening. Michaela?
Hi, everyone. So tonight we are again on the webinar. I'm going to go through our features. So we do have the Q&A section here at the bottom. So if you have questions for Molly, please use that section to ask them, and I will be using that to ask them on your behalf. We also have a chat feature. So if you want to say hi to Molly, please use that section there. And I will be sending those comments to her after this meeting. I am also recording this, so you'll be able to view this on our website. And we are live to Facebook. So if you're joining us from Facebook and you're using the comment section there, I am looking at that too.
Thank you, Michaela. Now I'd like to introduce my friend and fellow docent, Lori Searer. Lori has graciously agreed to facilitate tonight's discussion, and I really thank Lori. She's done this before. So Lori, hello, and thank you. I'm going to turn things over to Lori, and she will introduce tonight's author.
Well, I'm really pleased to introduce Molly Peacock, author of tonight's selection, The Paper Garden. An artist begins her life's work at 72. Molly is a noted essayist, biographer, and speaker. She's an award-winning poet. She teaches poetry, and she's had numerous residencies at universities all around the country. She mentors emerging writers, and she's considered to be a poetry activist. She's part of a project called Poetry in Motion, in which poetry is placed in transit systems of cities throughout the country, exposing it to millions of viewers every day. She holds dual citizenship in Canada and the United States, which I'm sure has been a real challenge the past 2 years. So I'm very pleased to welcome Molly and for her to present this beautifully written book. Thank you, Molly.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Lori. Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Michaela. It's a joy to be here. I don't know how many people who are participants are from Western New York in the Buffalo area, because I know that Facebook goes all over the place. But I'm particularly happy to be here in Western New York, if only virtually, but Toronto's practically in Western New York, at least from my point of view. The Paper Garden, Mrs. Delany begins her life's work at 72, is a biography, and it's also an art book, and it's also partly a memoir, because as a poet, I had never written a biography before, and and you can see that there are these really stunning illustrations in the book. I had not written a biography. I had the very good fortune of receiving a fellowship from the Leon Levy Center for the Biography so that I could learn how to write one. But I realized that because I'm a poet and because I have certain kinds of interests in creativity in general and how creative people put their lives together, I knew I had to write a different kind of biography. Yes, we go from birth to death, Mrs. Delany's birth to death, but we enter each phase of her life through an artwork. So every chapter begins with an artwork, and every chapter delves into some aspect of this utterly remarkable woman's life. And the question that drives the book is, how did a 72-year-old woman in 1772 invent a new art form? How is it that we think that Picasso and Matisse invented collage, when in fact there was a woman in 1772 putting together cut paper botanicals made of hundreds and hundreds of pieces of flowers? What brought her to that point? How did she bloom then? This is a story for everyone who feels they're a late bloomer, and for everyone who holds in their heart some art, some creative impulse that they are waiting to release. Here's your example. And I'm going to start off and read a few of the introductory pages from the Paper Garden. And then, with the help of Michaela, I'm going to swing into a small PowerPoint where I show you some of the works of Mrs. Delany. And after that, Lori and Mary have questions for me, which I'll be happy to answer. And perhaps those of you who are in the audience will be either, if you're on Zoom, post questions in the Q&A, please, not in the chat, but in the Q&A. And those of you in Facebook, on Facebook, you can comment in the, in the comments area. And because of Michaela, she'll be picking all of that up. So here's the beginning, the opening of the Paper Garden. Imagine starting your life's work at 72. At just that age, Mary Granville Pendarvis Delany, born May 14th, 1700, died April 15th, 1788, a fan of George Friedrich Handel, a sometime dinner partner of satirist Jonathan Swift, a wearer of green hooped satin gowns, and a fiercely devoted subject of blonde King George III, invented a precursor of what we know as collage. One afternoon in 1772, she noticed how the dropped petal of a geranium matched a piece of colored paper. After making that vital imaginative connection between paper and petal, she lifted the 18th century equivalent of an X-Acto blade, she'd have called it a scalpel, or a pair of filigree handled scissors, the kind that must have had a nose so sharp and delicate you could almost imagine it picking up a scent. With the instrument alive in her still rather smooth-skinned hand, she began to maneuver, carefully cutting out the exact geranium petal shape from the scarlet paper. Then she snipped out another, and another, and another, with the trance-like efficiency of repetition, commencing the most remarkable work of her life. She was born Mary Granville in 1700 at her father's country house in the Wiltshire village of Colston, matching her life with the start of this new century, one that would be shaped by many of her friends and acquaintances. She would see the rise of the coffee house. She would hear firsthand of the voyage of Captain Cook. She would attend her hero and friend Handel's Messiah. She would flirt with Jonathan Swift. And by the time she commenced her great work, she had long outlived her uncle, the selfish Lord Lansdowne. She had survived a marriage at age 17 to Alexander Pendarvis, a drunken 60-year-old squire who left her nothing but a widow's pension. She survived trying to get a court pension and a flirtation with Lord Baltimore. But with a life-saving combination of propriety and inner fire, she also designed her own clothes, took drawing lessons, cultivated stalwart lifelong friends, William Hogarth being one. She attended John Gay's The Beggar's Opera. She owned adorable cats, and she wrote 6 volumes worth of letters, many of them to her sister Anne. She bore no children, but at 43, deep into that widowhood, where she was struggling financially, she allowed herself to be kidnapped by love and to flout her family to marry Swift's friend, Dean Patrick Delany. They lived at Delville, an 11-acre estate near Dublin, which is now the home of the Dublin Botanical Gardens. I'm just going to make a little bit of a leap here to the year Mrs. Delany is 68. She's had this remarkable second marriage, midlife marriage, where with a husband who encouraged her to paint, where she began designing crewel work, doing all kinds of crafts, and where she personally began this flowering. And then she lost him and moved in with one of her friends. And this woman was the Duchess of Portland, who happened to be one of the richest women in England at the time. And she was staying with the Duchess, and something happened. I'll tell you what happened in a couple of minutes. But Mrs. Delany was forced to be still. She was an extremely energetic person, so it was a big deal for her to have to sit in one place. And that stillness, and I invite each one of you to think of still points in your life. COVID, for some people, has been a big help in that regard, because it forced a lot of people to become still and to notice what was around them. That's when she noticed how the red of that geranium, which was an exotic plant at the time. I mean, now they're so common, they're in everybody's backyards. But then her friend, the Duchess, paid an extravagant amount of money for a sample geranium. She made this imaginative connection. She cuts out the paper petal, and the Duchess comes in, and the Duchess is, says to her, what are you doing to my geranium? The Duchess actually thought that Mary had cut the bloom off the geranium and stuck it on a piece of paper. She couldn't tell the paper flower from the real one. And Mrs. Delany replied to her, Mrs. Delany wrote this down, quote, "I have invented a new way of imitating flowers." How did she have the eyesight to do it, let alone the physical energy? I'm just returning to the book here. How, with her 8th decade knuckles and wrists, did she manage the dexterity? Did her arm muscles not seize up? Now, Mrs. Delany's works rustle in leather-edged volumes in the British Museum's Department of Prints and Drawings study room, where they have been sequestered since her descendant, Lady Lanover, donated them in 1895. 72 years old. It gives a person hope. Who doesn't hold out the hope of starting a memorable project at a grand old age? A life's work is always unfinished and requires creativity till the day a person dies. Even if you've managed major accomplishments throughout your life and don't really need a model for making a mark, you do need a model for enriching an ongoing existence. So that's the beginning. And with Michaela's permission, I'm going to share my screen.
You should be able to, yeah.
Okay, let me try. Go. Oh, look at this. Now I need to go back. Whoops. I'm clicking. Hang on. And we're going to start again. All right. Here's Mrs. Delany in her 40s, looking pretty great. She's all dressed up in velvet for this. This is a miniature portrait. We're seeing it at a considerable size here. Here she is in a famous John Opie portrait. She's 82, and just look at the wisdom in this woman's eyes. Here is her passion flower. She did this. This is about a 10-year project, and she is at the height of this project in 1777 when she did lots of these. She would have a number of them going all at once, and this particular passion flower that she did, I'm going to show you a little, just a little detail here. There. See all of this? It looks painted. It looks painted, but these are individual pieces of cut paper. And one of the reasons they look paper, there's almost 300 pieces of paper in this particular bloom. So I can't hear your gasps, but I'm presuming you're gasping out there because the first time I saw this, I couldn't believe it. And the reason it looks painted is that there were no colored papers. She did not have access to colored papers except for wallpaper. She painted her papers and then cut them out, so that painterly quality that you get here is from that. Here's the very first one she did. Here's that geranium and what's called a scarlet lobelia. Her very first one at the Duchess's house. And you can see it, she cut them out to, and in the beginning, they just look like a pressed flower scrapbook. Just to give you an idea of her cutting skills, some 10, 12 years before she started the 985 cut paper botanicals that she did in her 70s, she often cut silhouettes, and she was a champion silhouette cutter. And for those of you who've ever cut a silhouette, usually you're cutting it out from the black paper and putting it on, pasting it on the white paper. And these silhouettes have been, are now used as cultural commentary by the African-American artist Kara Walker. Probably everyone has seen Kara Walker's work, riffing on the colonialism of silhouettes like this. Mrs. Delany, who often was a guest at people's houses, not, and people went of a certain class became kind of professional guests. They didn't have enough money to maintain their own houses, so they kept, you know, getting long-term stays at other people's. So she's has cut this out in the reverse way. She has put her scissors into the white paper and has cut these silhouettes out from inside in the opposite way that you would think the silhouette is cut out. And this will give you just a little bit of an idea of how incredible that is. Here is quite a tiny cut paper botanical collage that she did in 1776. And I hope that you can all see this. It's a little bit cut off on my screen, but I have a feeling maybe it isn't on yours. See this? This is an actual leaf. This is botanical material which she used in the collages, and they're fairly flat and also quite dramatic because they are on black paper. And Mrs. Delany had a very theatrical sense, and in her own garden thought of herself as staging her flowers. There you can see that, you know, you can see that the actual dried leaf, centuries old there. Here is a famous image of hers. It's a damask rose, and she even cut an insect bite into this leaf. You should know that she was, I'll show you a detail and tell you a tiny bit about her young life. I mean, she was talented and drawing, you know, and embroidering as a young child, encouraged by her father. She was one of 4 children, and she was the second of 4 children. And her father was the second son of a distinguished family, but his brother, of course, was the inheritor of the family's estate and money. So her father was in the military, had other kinds of appointments, had to earn his living, and he had to marry his daughters off without substantial dowries. And so one day, Mary is about 16, and he sends her to Longleat. And for those of you who watch British television, sometimes you see Longleat, and there is an animal show, one of the animal shows that occurs at Longleat, and you can visit Longleat now, this estate. So she's sent there, and she's staying there, and there are other people staying there, and it belongs to her uncle. And so she's having a nice time, and there's a great hall there, and everyone is gathered for dinner, and there's a huge storm. And so they're eating in the hall, there's lightning and thunder, and the storm is going on, and through the storm comes a knock on the door. Hang on. This is her sister, Anne. You can see what a sweet, sweet woman she is. Mm-hmm. And their correspondence is just the loveliest, almost lifelong correspondence between these 2 sisters. I'm going to go back to the storm now, and the knocking at the door, and the door is opened, and standing there, dripping wet, drunk as a skunk, his blubbery belly hanging over his belt, his clothes hanging out of his pants, wandering up to the door, coming to this dinner party. And he comes into the hall, and her uncle greets him. He greets the squire and says, "Oh, come and sit down. Come and sit down right next to my niece Mary." So she can't even stand the smell of him. But he's there, and they have dinner, and it takes her a few days to realize that she is for him. And basically, she will be sold in a family deal to the squire, to whom she will marry, and live an extraordinarily attenuated life as his wife for the next 6 or 7 years. I won't go into how she gets out of it and what happens to him, just onward. Take a look at this amazing thistle. Again, with all of the gradations of greens, she's got kind of a palette of greens that she uses, and the fineness of these thistly pointed leaves. Here's a super famous Mrs. Delany. Now Mrs. Delany is famous in certain circles, not to everyone. She's a discovery to many people, but here is her opium poppy. And you'll see, again, it looks so painted, but in fact, all of this is cut paper. Now, she did some painting, and for instance, this black is cut paper, but some of this down here is painted on with a brush. She had a goal. I wanted to include some North American flowers here, and this is what's called the Canadian lily. And I just wanted to, I consulted a botanist in the UK to make sure I had the right Canadian sample here to include to show all of you. And each one of her flowers has a personality. And many of them are positioned on the page as if they were clothed, really. They are, I'm just going to go back a second here. Take a look at this. That flower is dancing. There is a sense in which her flowers are wearing ball gowns. She designed her own court gown, by the way. That poppy is dancing. Her flowers are very much in the shapes and gestures of the women of her day. Here's her handwriting, just to give you a little sense of that beautiful copper plate hand that she had. It's a letter to her sister. And here is Dean Patrick Delany, who rescued her to a degree in midlife, but she had a lot of suitors after she was widowed and led, I mean, at least a good 20 years of her life on her own. So she was part of the blue stocking circle. She stormed Parliament for certain very nascent basic rights for women. She was very, very engaged with the culture of her day. So when Patrick Delany came along, he had to ask her several times. And it was sort of a big deal because she wasn't free to give her own permission. She had to ask her older brother, even at the age of 45, whether she could marry him. And the older brother was not happy with it. But she went ahead anyway. Here's one of her most sensuous flowers, a magnolia, and these are huge petals. And you should know that other botanical artists did magnolias. They were hugely popular at the time and very wildly expensive. And Mrs. Delany positioned hers much differently. This one looks, I mean, her magnolia looks like she's wearing a negligee. And the center of the magnolia is quite a phallic form. Here's another dancing lady, the everlasting pea. And I just want to point out here, this one really has such a distinct figure. And if you follow here, and I think you can see my pointer on the screen. Yes?
Yes.
You can. Okay.
Yes.
Follow this around and look at the pair of scissors upside down in the tendrils of the pea vine. And here's a little suggestion of a pair of scissors here. You can see just how abstract a blow up of one of these details can become. Here's Ruth Hayden. Without Ruth, I couldn't have written this book. Ruth was a descendant of Mrs. Delany, a lateral descendant from her sister, and she wrote the original Mrs. Delany, Her Life and Her Flowers for the British Museum, a book that I will probably tell you the story of how I encountered it during the question period. But here is Ruth, who has since passed away, but what really took me under her wing when she certainly didn't have to. And for those of you who love British novels and films of the 1950s, I just wanted to show you Ruth in her scarf, who played such a key role in the background of the writing of this book. And here's my mom. This is my mother in Perry, New York, at my grandfather's general store and gas station on Route 246 between Pavilion and Perry. And these two women come into the story because, as I said, it's not a traditional biography. My story comes in a few pages at the end of each chapter as I'm developing my biography skills and as I'm tracking Mrs. Delany down and as I'm thinking about women in my life and their creativity, how they came into their creativity, how they used it or didn't use it, and what happened to them. One of her later North American images with real botanical material in it. And her characteristic signature, that's an MD that she would cut out and put in the corner of the collage. This is such a famous one. I had to show it. It's her winter cherry, and it's a knockout. You've seen it on a lot of cards and aprons and tea cozies and teacups and all the many things that are manufactured out of Mrs. Delany images. And this is actual botanical material pasted onto the physalis, or we don't call them winter cherries. We're calling them, someone is going to think of the name that we usually call
Chinese lanterns.
Chinese lanterns. Yes, that's right. That's right. But this, I mean, that looks painted, but that is cut paper. Cut paper, folks. And here is one of her last images. She set as a goal that she would make 1,000 of these. And I'm going to bring you back to that still point. She's at Bulstrode, this enormous, enormous estate belonging to her friend after the dean passes away. And he, the end of his life was very, very difficult. And Mrs. Delany was absolutely just exhausted. So she was limping to her friend's house, and she's so withdrawn and depressed, and I could see her handwriting started to deteriorate at this time. I mean, it picks up, but she's a mess of grief. And her friend says, well, come out to this garden with me. We'll go visit so-and-so's garden. So Mrs. Delany goes. I don't think she really wants to go, but she's dragging herself there. And she gets stung on the foot by what she calls a gnat. Who knows what it was, but her foot swells up to like twice its size. She has an allergic reaction, and they have to carry her home and summon the doctor, and who insists that she sit with her foot up. And that is how she ends up looking at the geranium, looking at a piece of wallpaper, and putting it together with one of the very few inspirations of the beginning of an art form that we have on record, as she recorded it in her letters. So at that time, she decided she would live with her friend, and the Duchess of Bulstrode, this house, Bulstrode, was so magnificent that King George and Queen Charlotte decided that they should celebrate their oldest child. They had 13 children. The oldest son, the oldest prince's birthday, with a breakfast at Bulstrode. So everyone goes into a flap about this. And this is right out of Julian Fellows. I don't know why he hasn't written the story of Mrs. Delany, but he suddenly, on the horizon appears the king's coach and a retinue of coach after coach after coach, all of these people coming for breakfast. And Mrs. Delany says to her friend, listen, I'm going to go back down to my little apartment. I don't feel that it's my place to somehow meet the king and queen here. I'm hiding out. Her friend lets her go, but the king and queen are very interested in botany. They have begun the Kew Gardens, and they've heard about Mrs. Delany. They ask for her. The Duchess sends her daughter down to find Mrs. Delany, who is not dressed for royalty, but up she comes, and they ask to see her work. And there is this wonderful moment of meeting where the king and queen kind of adopt her as their aunt. This wonderful older woman who was incredibly friendly, easygoing, and was easygoing with the royal family, although respectful, as she obviously would have been. And they make this connection, which is going to be very important for her work and for her in her later life.
I can't hear her.
No, nor can I.
Whoops, notice the abstraction in this one. And here we are. We're at the end, and I'm going to stop my screen. Thank you very much. I'll just continue on this little teeny end story. Mrs. Delany, was a goal-oriented person, and she decided, okay, how many of these am I going to make? And she needed the botanical samples. And so people all over England, when they had oh, say if someone's magnolia was coming into bloom, they would write to her saying, oh, it's about to come into bloom. I think you should get in your carriage and come up here and try to make a flower mosaic of it. She would pile all of her materials into the coach, and along with her niece, because she had no children, but up in her 70s, she ends up taking in a niece of hers. So she's raising this little girl, takes the little girl and all of her equipment, goes and cuts out the flower, and she's heading toward 1,000. She's losing her eyesight, and when the Duchess dies, it turns out that the Duchess did not leave her any money. They were friends. Mrs. Delany didn't want anything, but she was stranded. And the king and the queen, the king says to the queen, well, what are we going to do about Mrs. Delany? And the queen says, well, why don't we invite her to live with us? So she spends the last 6 or 7 years living at the court and finishing her very last flower mosaics, and she stops at 985 because she was a realist. She was not a perfectionist, and she knew that her skills would not take her through that last 15. She stopped there, and I find this very, very moving. In some ways, she didn't make her goal, but in other ways, she addressed her internal need and her sense of her oeuvre, her art as a whole, and stopped there at 985, and it is a remarkable, remarkable body of work. Okay, questions?
Laura, you're muted.
Okay, sorry about that, Molly. I was just really impressed with the presentation, and this woman was remarkable. In the book, there's a line that she never thought her works would be viewed by the public. She said that she wasn't an expert in anything except observing, she was just very self-deprecating, I think. And one of the parts of the book that really struck me was her first marriage. And it had such an impact on her entire life that the description of the marriage starts on page 77 of the book, and there's still remnants of how that affected her on page 214 of the book.
Yeah, I mean, yes, that is absolutely true. Just imagine yourself. Okay, just think of yourself at 16. Think of how you view the world. Think of what your concerns are. Think of the freshness of your body, the vulnerability of your body, and then imagine being introduced to this 60-something drunken squire who essentially is going to, you are supposed to be his passport. He had no children, and he needed an heir. So you're supposed to be his passport to that. And not only that, so he takes her off to Roscoe Castle, his castle, and it is so dreary, so damp, so decrepit, so horrible. And she's there, and it's so cold. She's just absolutely freezing. She goes into this place, and she sees a light down a hallway. And she's so excited. She's thinking, oh, there must be a conservatory or something. There's someplace warm where I could go be. She gets all the way down and realizes that the light is coming because there's a hole in the roof. Mm-hmm. And this is an image for her life at that moment, at that time. and he had gout.
Mhm.
So he was compelled to, I mean, he compelled her to be in cold rooms because any sort of heat would exacerbate his gout. So she sat shivering, reading to him for hours. And the trauma of this, in many ways, never left her. And it doesn't leave us. This is, I mean, the idea of being, I mean, we know about these so-called forced marriages, but her letters and the fragment of a memoir that she left really give a visceral picture of what it's like to, I mean, to basically be sold off. I mean, in the most so-called elegant way, okay, with a whole dowry full of dresses, etc. But to be sold off to be in this situation. And what was worse is she did not give him any children. And because she didn't, she was not left with his estate. So after all of that, she got a very small widow's pension.
Well, she says in the book, it really mirrors what Princess Diana used to say. She says, I was sacrificed. And
Yes.
Princess Diana has gone on the record saying that the day she got married to Prince Charles, she felt like she was a lamb being led to the slaughter.
Absolutely. I mean,
And
you're so right. You're so right. It is a mirror of the Diana situation.
I also I was interested in how you as the author and the subject, Mary Delany, were different periods in time, but the stories mirrored one another. There was intersections of the story between you and her. And I felt like the book was almost a cathartic experience for you. Am I correct in that assumption?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I got interested in her for a number of reasons. Back in 1986, when I was a very young teacher at a Quaker school in New York City, there was an exhibit of her work at the Morgan Library. And I was supposed to meet a friend at the Museum of Modern Art, but I went to the Morgan Library beforehand because I really wanted to see these works. And I was entranced by them. I know, I'm young and I'm supposed to be entranced by abstract expressionism, but instead I'm focused on these amazing pieces of botanical art. And I think I'm going to go buy the catalog. I run into the gift shop and the catalog is there. And it's a huge British hardcover, at the time, very expensive. I looked at the price and I thought, okay, I'm not getting the catalog. I pass it up and I go on into my life. Years later, I meet my high school boyfriend, Michael Groden. We went to Kenmore East Senior High in Tonawanda. I meet him. He has become a distinguished James Joyce scholar, and I'll say a word about that later. But and we both have invitations to speak at Oxford, and we do that. We go back to the British Museum because we're on our way back to North America. But we stop at the British Museum and my husband has to make a phone call. And this is before cell phones, just before cell phones. And he's on the phone in that phone booth in the lobby for forever. And I'm bored and I go into the gift shop, which says Granville. It's the Granville gift shop, which is a family name of Mrs. Delany's. And I go, my husband's talking so long that I actually get to the last table in the bookshop and I see that book that I couldn't afford in 1986. And I buy it. And we go to the airport, and on the airplane on the way home, I think, wow, I'm in my late 40s in this wonderful midlife marriage that's fostering my creativity. Mrs. Delany's in her 40s in this wonderful midlife marriage that was fostering her creativity. Centuries apart, classes apart, but connecting in ways that I think women's stories do connect over time. And so it made sense to me to show these glimpses of my life as I'm tracking down every instance of creativity that I can find in Mrs. Delany's life. And I'm also drawing a portrait of my own marriage at the time.
Would you like me to continue, Michaela, or do you want to take other questions?
Let me take some questions. We have a few
Okay.
here. Our first one here is from Christine. She says, what parts of Mary Delany's life do you find resonate with your own?
Oh gosh. Well, I really do think it's my 40s and 50s as I'm inside my own marriage and doing, that's when I started writing prose. I'm a pretty well-published poet. I didn't think of myself as somebody who could write a memoir, for instance, which I did write, suddenly start writing a biography, but I'm married to a scholar and watching him do all of this fascinating analysis of documents of the past. And I'm thinking, gee, you know what, maybe I could try this a little bit. And I'm expanding as she expanded. And the metaphor I use is, and my guess is there are people in the audience who are gardeners who understand about plants. You know, if you have a plant and something lops off the top of the plant, I mean, it could be pruning scissors, but could also just be a storm or a dog or something. The plant gets traumatized by being cut off in the main growing source of it. It gets cut off, but happily, plants have side nodes, side node growth that then starts to emerge when the top growth is cut back. And that is how I felt about Mrs. Delany and about myself, that suddenly in midlife, these side nodes were growing. Nascent talents from childhood kept emerging. And part of that is due to an anchoring love relationship that allows that to happen.
So we have another comment from Virginia. She says, her story is so inspiring, such resilience and creativity, seemingly being her own person, notwithstanding the pressures of society, especially being in the orbit of royalty. To what do you attribute her strength?
Well, I guess I would have two answers to that. Even as a child, she had a vibrancy to her personality. And she was encouraged with her gifts, and she also was practical, even as a child. When she was 16 and married, which not exactly a child, but as an adolescent, and she's married off, she could have rebelled against that, but she knew that her family would depend on her financially. And that if she didn't do this, it would be a disaster for them. So there was something in her personality that allowed her to be alive within terrible burdens. And then there is simply the interestingly ideal position that she was in after the squire died, because she was a widow. She didn't have to be on the marriage market. She lived sometimes with a friend, and established a whole network of female friendships. And these, they were very nurturing toward her, she toward them, and it was very freeing. And she also traveled to Ireland, an extremely warm and embracing country, and a big, big breath of literal fresh air from being stifled in London. So her circumstances allowed her her growth, but also her personality allowed her growth. I hope that's a good enough answer.
This next one's for Corinne. Do you know what type of paper Mary used and where she would have purchased it?
Yeah, she used any kind of paper she could find. And that meant paper scraps, but also papers that were made in, a lot of papers were made in Holland and then imported into England. But at this time also, British paper making began as an industry, really. And so this is cotton rag paper, and paper and linen paper. I mean, so basically paper made from old clothes, and I mean, that's what rag paper is. And and some of those papers they took on the color of whatever the rags were. So sometimes those papers were gray, sometimes bluish or greenish. So she was buying papers. People were giving her papers. People gave her wallpaper. People gave her fine writing paper. She acquired those things as well. So there was quite a mix. And if you ever go to the British Museum to see them, and they will let you see them, you have to ask for them. You have to make an appointment and ask for them, but they're more than happy to bring them to you. You'll see the different kinds of papers that she used. She also colored the paper black. She made those black backgrounds. That's not black paper. There were no black papers. She took sometimes what's called iron gall ink, or made black inks, or black wash out of ashes. I mean, there's the analysis of the papers detects a lot of different kinds of substances in them, and made that matte black surface onto which she painted pasted the flowers. And now you're going to ask me what kind of paste she used, but maybe, well, I'll stop there because there might be another question.
So I have one more I want to say right now. It's from Julia. She says, how do you feel your background as a poet informs your long form writing style?
Well, that's a really interesting question. Something I've asked myself. I think it goes something like this. As a poet, I'm an observer. I'm a noticer in the same way that Mrs. Delany was a noticer. I noticed her noticing. I went through all of her letters looking for those instances of her noticing and her record of her creativity. That it's the poet in me that allowed me to take her images and let those images be doors into periods of her life and impulses of her life, that let those images become living metaphors in a way. And being a poet, I have the confidence in my own creativity. I've thought about creativity from the inside for a long time. And when I met another creative person from another century, I was able to extrapolate from my own sense of how artwork gets made.
There's two more questions, but I'm actually going to save them for the end. I think they'll be the best when we're wrapping up this. So Lori or Mary, if you have other questions.
Yes, I did have a question. You said in the book, Molly, a poet is a failed painter. And I wondered about if there was a difficulty in switching from writing poetry to writing an entire book.
Yes, absolutely. I practically had a nervous breakdown doing this. I have to tell you, I was just, I went back into therapy and it took so long. I mean, the research, and people have an idea of writing a biography that somehow or another you gather all the facts. I mean, it's like a high school research paper, right? You gather all the facts and then you sit down and write the paper. I was just awash in this stuff. I mean, she left so many letters. I had to go to England. I was going to this place. I was going to that place. I was trying to walk in her footsteps. I was collecting notes, then losing notes, and it was taking so long. And at one point, I mean, I simply I sat down in my office, not on a chair. I sank to the floor and I was crying because I just thought I can't handle all of this. It was so foreign from writing poetry. But at the same time, this is just personally, I'm persistent. And I thought, damn, I've gotten this far. I am just going to put one foot in front of the other and try to make sense of all this and put it into a book. Because for me, writing is thinking. And as I wrote, things started to come together. I'm not the kind of person who separates facts from writing. I'm writing and I'm researching and I'm going back to a letter because somehow I've written something and I'm thinking, oh, Mrs. Delany said something about this. Let me find it. Of course, it'd take me days to find it, but finally I would find it and then keep putting it together. And I did not understand until after the book was published that I was making a collage to a collage artist.
How long did it take you to actually research and then write the book?
Well, I first read Ruth Hayden's book just after 9/11. So we're in the fall of 2001. I finished the book, the very, very end of it, because I couldn't kill Mrs. Delany. It took me a really long time. And my publisher was going, you have to finish this book. And I had to finally kill Mrs. Delany. And that happened in December 2009. So it was an 8-year span. I was not working on it steadily. I did other things. I do a bit of acting, and I was working on a one-woman show in poems that I did off Broadway while I was doing a little bit of writing about Mrs. Delany. So I would say hardcore writing took place between 2006 and 2009. But it was certainly percolating in there before that.
I just have one final comment and then I'll turn it over to Michaela. You can still see though the poet and the prose writing in this book. And I just picked out one selection of pages, but I'm sure there's others from pages 259 to 261. And it starts with her Irish life was behind her, caught in an updraft like a kite's tail. And then there's a whole section after that. It goes on for about, it's actually the equivalent of 2 full pages, and that's prose. So you could still see you, the original poet, prose writer, coming through when I read that section of the book.
Yes, I took a leap. I thought, I needed to have time pass in the book, and I understood as a poet that if I made a kind of litany, then time would pass for the reader. And I say, after that, now let Mrs. Delany be blooded. Let her stop painting. Let her sit in a stupor. Let food be tasteless in her mouth. Let Mrs. Delany's friend's son, Harry Hamilton, be sent with General Wolfe to conquer Quebec. Let the French General Montcalm surrender. Let George Washington don his French and Indian war uniform and stride into the Continental Congress. Let George III take his former tutor, Lord Bute, as his advisor and then discredit him. Let Martha Washington bear 4 children before she marries George and let one of them survive, while Queen Charlotte bears 15 children and 13 of them survive. Let blood be shed. Let boils erupt on Benjamin Franklin's body. Let Louis XVI finance the American Revolution. Let the Canada lily receive the scorched fields. Let Captain Cook set off on his voyage with Joseph Banks. And in doing that and bringing all those names in, I could unfold the American Revolution. I could let Mrs. Delany's widowhood open up, and I could do it. I could do it as a poet does it, and with a poet's confidence. It's a weird sort of metaphorical confidence that I have as a poet. That comes from years of writing poetry and feeling that, yes, if I make a metaphor, my readers are going to understand. They're going to make the leap too. And so this book is a combination of metaphors and footnotes. There's a lot of footnotes in this book. Mm-hmm. Not that you have to read them. I hope the book flies by you and you never have the sense of that there was any labor behind it at all.
We have a few more questions here from participants. One is from Leslie. Do you have any idea how long she worked on her pieces?
Oh yeah. I think that she would, I mean, say in 1777 when which was her most productive year. I think she might have, I was going to say she did 38 of them, but she had to have done more than that. Because she was working at a rate of about 100 a year. But there would be months that might go by when she wouldn't have a botanical specimen, and then other times when she would, or she'd start something and then finish it in the wintertime. And she'd have a bunch going because she'd be cutting out papers and letting them dry. And she used flour and water as paste. And just very simple flour and water. And so, she could have 12 or 15 of these things going. And it's tough to say. And they might take a few weeks to finish, because she's painting paper, cutting, pasting, letting them dry. So it's a little bit tough to say, not months and months. I mean, I think we're thinking weeks, a number of weeks, maybe a month, that before something emerged, maybe just a few days.
All right, another question we have from Mary Lou says, did you mention an association with Hogarth earlier in this presentation? And she said, if so, can you repeat it?
Oh, yes, yes. She knew Hogarth, and certainly admired his painting. They weren't the best of friends. I mean, she was quite good friends with Handel. I mean, she was a close friend of Handel's. And I think that his satirical view, and certainly his satirical view of marriage, she shared. She would, in her letters, I mean, she made no bones about what she thought marriage was, the kind of bondage that women entered into as they were married. And Hogarth, of course, reflected this in some of his painted sequences of art, and I think she definitely shared in that spirit.
Mary, now that we have you back, did you have some questions for Molly?
Thank you. I'm sorry I've been gone for so long, but I've watched it on Facebook. So thank you so much, Molly. It's just one of those things. Thank you. So I guess I have a few comments because you answered a lot of questions that I had already. One of them is just about how much I enjoy the way you interfaced your life with Mary's life. Molly, Mary, both of you had a life journey, and how the book wasn't really a straight biography, but certainly an exploration of what it is to be human, what human expression is all about, and finding one's own self and finding joy within one's own set of talents. I think came out so strongly. I was surprised at how flirty she was for an 18th century woman.
Oh,
and how sensual everything was, maybe because it was sort of under the surface that had boiled a little hotter, perhaps. I don't know.
I can make a comment on that if you want.
Sure.
The 18th century was very sexy, and Mrs. Delany could be very bald, very bold. When the 19th century cooled that down considerably. When it's a very peculiar time because women don't have a lot of rights in the 18th century, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that they're wilting flowers, not at all. And that, I mean, people routinely talked about bodily functions. Say if you're at a dinner party and you have to go to the bathroom, well, there's no bathroom for you to go. You walk behind a screen, there's a servant there, you lift your skirts, and the servant's got like something that is looks like a gravy boat and flips that under your skirt, and there you are peeing away as everybody else is eating. They know you're in there peeing. I mean, it's people are bodily very close to one another, and make all kinds of comments, all kinds of jokes. And people had vigorous, juicy sex and made no bones about it. And those deep gender distinctions that we have lived with until fairly recently were much more fluid in the 18th century.
Were you, on that same note, were you suggesting a liaison between her and
No,
the other woman?
I don't know. She did definitely have close women friends. some of whom were absolutely gay. There, I mean, no question about that. And then the question is, well, was Mary gay or was Mary bisexual? These categories, they were not so defined in Mary's day. And so people have made all kinds of conjectures. And I guess I would say could be.
Maybe.
I mean, certainly could be. Was her relationship, getting married at 45 to a 50-something-year-old man? I mean, was that the hottest thing in bed? Who knows, except there's a sense of her sensuality at that time that makes you think that they were getting along. So it's tough to say. Let's say this: she had a wonderful sense of her own physicality, and of her own sensuous being in the world, and that may have invested in a number of different relationships. And I bring it up in the book because I don't know, but other scholars have speculated, and I thought, well, it would be foolish of me just to I don't know, picture a traditionally romantic relationship. No, this is a complex, vigorous, sensuous woman who had lifelong friendships. I do not think, for instance, that she had a relationship with her best friend, the Duchess of Portland. I don't think that was the case at all. There's just nothing there that would say that. But some of her other pals, maybe so. I don't know.
I love how you suggested that her creativity in many ways was fostered by all of these friendships, that like learning is not an isolated thing, and nor is creativity, and that how she drew from these friendships to actually bolster up her own creative life.
Oh, absolutely. There were all of these women doing fascinating arts. So there are women writing, painting, designing. There were women taking needlecraft to great new heights, and she was part of all of that. And it was at a time when there was so much exchange, and she knew how to be a friend. I mean, not everybody knows how to be a friend. And I do talk about my mother in this book. My mother had a talent for friendship, and she had lifelong friends. And being a child among these women, I learned about those kinds of friendships, and I'm so lucky and privileged to be a friend to many people and have many friends whom I've kept throughout my life. My oldest friend in Buffalo, I played with when we were 3. We are still in touch. I mean, these are long relationships.
That's wonderful.
And I think that there's a lot of exchange among friends that nurtures art. I really do.
And we're getting late, so Michaela, did you have?
Yeah, I just have
questions?
2 more questions. So one is from Julia. She loved your presentation and she's really inspired to buy the book. She's wondering, what is the better one to get, the hardcover or the soft cover version? What's going to be the better?
Okay. They're both great. They're both great. The Canadian hardcover and the Canadian paperback are printed on art paper. So it's printed on, let's see if I can find, printed on shiny paper where the illustrations really pop. And so, I mean, you could go into Amazon.ca, for instance, and find a Canadian one. The American and British are printed on a more matte paper. So, and also it's extremely difficult to get a hardcover these days. really difficult, and they're very expensive.
I got it on a secondary
Oh,
market.
you did.
I
Oh,
did.
very good. I'm glad. So
Lori has my
yeah,
paperback.
there's secondhand copies around of the hardcover.
Yes.
Go.
It was
go-
brand
if you
new.
can afford it.
but-
Go for it. But the paperbacks are really nice. They're really.
Our last question's from Jasira. She says, can you please tell us a little bit more about your new book?
Yes. Oh, what a perfect last question. I've written another one. It is a companion volume. I leapt centuries to the 19th century and leapt continents to North America in the 19th century. And this book is called Flower Diary, in which Mary Heaster Reed paints, travels, marries, and opens a door. And Mary Heaster Reed painted in Canada and in Toronto and in the Catskill Mountains, and was a member of the Onteora Artist Colony there. She also studied at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, where she met her husband, George Reed. And off they went to Europe. They got married and went to Europe, ran out of money, came back to Canada, where they opened a little art school, about 3 blocks from where I live. But she floated back and forth between Canada and the United States. And she was a flower painter and landscape painter. And this work is exquisite. It's really remarkable. Nobody's heard of her, although in her day, she showed at the Buffalo Exposition. She showed at the Louisiana Exposition. She showed at the Chicago Exposition. She worked in both countries and painted and was educated also in Paris. She and George sold up all of their paintings. Her husband was an artist as well, and sold everything to finance a year studying in Paris. Her story is basically a story. My question is, how does a woman have a painting career and a thriving marriage in the 19th century? She was just in the first generation of married women artists who thought of themselves as professionals. Mrs. Delany did not think of herself as a professional. She would never have sold one of her works or something. Just not even a concept. But it was a concept for Mary Heaster Reed, who thought of herself as a professional artist selling work to maintain an income, and she did, and they're remarkable. She, as the all-male Canadian group of 7 rose in reputation, her reputation sank, and soon nobody knew who she was. But happily, some scholars still followed her work, and I can say that this was a very different book to write, because she didn't leave diaries, she didn't leave letters. I had to construct her life from the outside in, but luckily I had the paper garden experience, so I think I was able to do it for a flower diary. And one other thing, flower diary accommodates a love triangle. Mary Heaster Reed had, and her husband had, a third party in their lives. A painter was 25 years younger, named Mary Rynch, also fabulously talented. And their interrelationships weave through this biography as well.
And I'm going to share my good news and my good fortune, and that is that Molly has agreed to come back in 2003, and we will talk about her new book at that point in time. So we haven't set the date yet, but stay tuned, because that is going to happen. I'm very excited, and first of all, thank you, Michaela, so much for all your technical help and for reading the questions and keeping us on track. And Lori, you had wonderful questions. Thank you for that. But Molly, I'm going to applaud you. It was just such an exceptional book and a fabulous evening. Thank you so much. I'm very excited you're agreeing to come back.
Oh, thank you so much, Mary. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the second invitation. Thank you for your questions, Lori. Thank you, Michaela, for making everything so smooth. And Mary, thank you for reappearing. We're so glad to see you.
I don't know what happened, but here I am. Just in time to remind everyone that March 3rd is our next book club. It's The Girl Who Threw Butterflies by Mick Cochran. And many of you know him. He's the chair of Canisius College English Department and a professor there. It'll be facilitated by our fellow docent, Andrea Holden. And I encourage everyone to consider facilitating one of our book clubs, especially if you haven't done it already. Please be sure to visit the center this second Friday when we will have our in-person second Friday experiences. I invite everybody to come to the center to see Charles Birchfield's exhibition that's currently up called A Lifetime of Themes, with over 30 works that are on loan from all over the country, many of which have never been in Buffalo, may never be in Buffalo again during our lifetime. You really don't want to miss that. And then this Saturday is our family day. So if you have little ones, please be sure to bring them.
Saturday.
Next
the 12th.
Saturday. Right. The 12th. Thank you, Michaela. Thank you. Good. I have a little time to put my little end together. Michaela's on top of it. Her end is already accomplished. But that is sponsored by Hyatt's All Things Creative. I think that's it. Thank you all. Molly, thank you again and again for this beautiful book that I've reread now and know I will reread many more times. And thank you, audience, for being with us. Please join us again. Thank you all. And I guess that's it. Good night, everyone.
Have a good night.
Good night.